At the end of the last episode, I said, if you've been tired for longer than seems reasonable, this episode's for you. Most men who are sleeping badly think they have a sleep problem. What many of them actually have is a health problem that's expressing itself through sleep, and the difference matters considerably. In this episode, I'll be talking about sleep, what it does, what happens when it goes wrong, and why the thing that many men reach for to help is actually making things worse. By the end of the episode, you'll have an understanding about why sleep isn't the passive and uneventful state many men assume it is. You'll have a clearer picture of what poor sleep is doing to your mood and your cognitive function. You'll also know what the evidence says helps, as opposed to what feels like it should help, but actually doesn't. This is one of the more practical and useful episodes to date, so let's get on with it. Let's start with the most common misconception about sleep, which is it's a passive state during which nothing particularly important happens. It really isn't. Sleep is one of the most active periods of the day, because during sleep, the brain itself isn't resting, it's actually very active, and it's performing a set of maintenance functions that are so fundamental to both physical and mental health that when they're disrupted, the effects radiate outwards into almost every aspect of functioning. Sleep cycles run in roughly 90-minute loops, moving through distinct stages of light sleep, deep sleep, and REM sleep. Each of these stages does different things. Deep sleep, sometimes known as slow wave sleep, is where the most intensive physical restoration occurs. Human growth hormone is released. Tissue repair takes place. The immune system consolidates its activities. Even memories are processed and transferred from short-term to long-term storage. And, in a finding that's attracted significant scientific attention, the brain's glymphatic system activates. Now, you may not have heard of the glymphatic system, but it's best thought of as a waste disposal system, or perhaps even a washing machine. During deep sleep, the system itself clears metabolic waste products, including amyloid beta proteins, the ones that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. The brain, in other words, cleans itself during sleep. If you disrupt the process, well, the waste accumulates. REM sleep is the stage most often associated with vivid dreams, and this is where the emotional processing happens. The brain during REM revisits the emotional experiences of the day and processes them in a neurochemical environment that's quite different from waking. Because sleep is associated with lower levels of noradrenaline, which is the stress-associated neurotransmitter, it means that emotional memories can be processed and integrated with the full physiological charge of original experience. You may have heard sleep described as overnight therapy, and that's partly because it takes the raw emotional material of the day and it does something more constructive with it. When REM sleep is disrupted, for example by alcohol, which suppresses it, or by sleep apnea, which fragments it, or by, say, chronic sleep deprivation, which prevents sufficient cycling through all the stages, the emotional processing doesn't happen properly, and the emotional residue of the day carries over, completely unprocessed, into the next. By now you'll have guessed that the effects of sleep disruption on mental health are immediate and quite cumulative, and they're considerably more serious than a lot of men appreciate, so a wise next step would be to talk about what happens when it goes wrong. Let's start with just a single night of poor sleep. That one broken night produces measurable changes in psychological functioning. There's a part of the brain called the amygdala, It's the brain's threat detection system, and it becomes significantly more reactive. As a result, people in general react much more strongly to upsetting or pleasant things than people who slept well. So, if you're sleep deprived, something like a rude comment or bad news or a small problem even can feel a lot more intense emotionally than it might do normally. Another part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, ordinarily moderates the amygdala's responses, and it provides a kind of rational brake. But in a sleep-deprived person, it's much less effective. The result is a brain that's more easily alarmed, less able to regulate its own responses, and significantly more prone to anxiety, irritability, and emotional overreaction. This helps to explain why a bad night's sleep can make everything feel worse. The cognitive effects are equally significant. Sustained attention, working memory, decision-making, impulse control, and the capacity for complex thinking all degrade with sleep deprivation. And here's something worth knowing. Sleep deprivation also impairs your ability to assess your own impairment. You don't know how badly you're functioning because this part of the brain that would normally tell you is amongst the first to go. The man running on 5 hours, who's confident in his judgment and performance, is, in most cases, wrong. So the question is, what is chronic sleep deprivation? Well, it can actually be more than one thing. Consistently getting less than 7 hours, or getting sufficient hours but they're broken and of poor quality, has the potential to produce a different and more serious set of consequences. The relationship between chronic poor sleep and depression is bidirectional and very well established. By bidirectional, I mean depression disrupts sleep, reducing deep sleep and increases early morning waking. Yet, disrupted sleep also maintains and deepens depression, reducing emotional regulation, increasing negative cognitive bias, and depleting the neurochemical resources that we need to support mood. The two conditions form a kind of feedback loop that, once established, is genuinely difficult to break without addressing both simultaneously. Various studies have found that people with insomnia are approximately 10 times more likely to develop clinical depression than those who sleep normally. And in the relationship with anxiety disorders, it's similarly strong. Chronic sleep deprivation is associated with elevated baseline cortisol. Cortisol, you may remember, is the stress hormone, which means that the body's stress response system is running hotter than it should, even in the absence of an identifiable stressor. And the cognitive effects of a chronic poor sleep accumulate in ways that mirror the early stages of dementia. There's impaired memory consolidation, and that's the process your brain turns new experiences or information into stable long-term memories. There's a reduction in executive functioning. In other words, it's harder to manage and organize things. And there's a slowing down of processing speed. The brain's nightly cleanup of amyloid beta, which depends on adequate deep sleep, is one of the mechanisms by which deep sleep protects against neurodegenerative diseases. Its consistent disruption has consequences that may not become apparent for decades. After the age of 40, sleep often tends to get worse, which has biological underpinnings. The first is circadian rhythm changes. The internal biological clock that governs the sleep-wake cycle shifts with age and tends to advance, meaning we have the urge to sleep earlier and wake up earlier. This often conflicts with the social and professional schedules that keep middle-aged men up later than their biology would prefer, and it produces a chronic state of circadian misalignment. The second is a reduction in deep sleep. The proportion of time spent in slow-wave sleep declines significantly with age and actually begins in the 30s, and it continues through midlife. As mentioned, this is the sleep stage most responsible for physical restoration, memory consolidation, and lymphatic cleaning process. Its decline is one of the reasons that sleep feels less restorative in midlife, even when the duration is adequate. And the third, in men at least, is testosterone decline. Testosterone and sleep also have a bidirectional relationship. Poor sleep reduces testosterone levels, and declining testosterone, in turn, affects sleep quality. Men experiencing significant testosterone decline in midlife often report changes in sleep as one of the earliest and most disruptive symptoms. The fourth is sleep apnea. Obstructive sleep apnea, in which the airways partially or fully collapse during sleep, causes repeated brief arousals and becomes significantly more common in men after 40. Particularly in those who've gained weight around the neck and the abdomen. It's estimated that the majority of cases go undiagnosed. Sleep apnea is strongly associated with depression, cognitive impairment, cardiovascular disease, and metabolic disruption. And the fifth, and perhaps the most pervasive for men in midlife, is stress and rumination. The particular flavor of midlife stress, financial pressures, professional demands, relationship complexities and caring responsibilities is exceptionally good at producing the 3 a.m. waking that so many men in this age group experience. The mind, freed from the distractions of the day and with no immediate problem solving available, defaults to rumination, which is cycling through concerns without resolution. Rumination isn't a sleep disorder in the clinical sense, but it is a psychological content of midlife expressing itself in the only quiet time available. With all these issues with sleep disruption, it's hardly surprising that people turn to things they think might help, and a substantial proportion of men who report difficulty sleeping use alcohol to help them fall asleep. Now, it's counterproductive in a way that's not always appreciated. Alcohol certainly does reduce sleep onset time. In other words, it makes it easier to fall asleep. But it also suppresses REM sleep. It typically fragments sleep and it increases early morning waking as blood alcohol levels fall and a kind of rebound arousal occurs. The man who drinks to sleep is getting much less in the way of restorative sleep, and it matters not just because poor sleep is damaging, but because it creates a kind of dependence loop. Alcohol disrupts sleep, and disrupted sleep increases stress and anxiety. Increased stress and anxiety often increases the desire to drink. Drinking disrupts sleep further. Many men caught in this loop don't recognize it as alcohol-related because the initial sleep onset is relatively easy. The problem is what follows. So if you're regularly using alcohol as a sleep aid, you may be trying to solve a problem while making the underlying issues worse. So it's important to look at what really works. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, usually abbreviated as CBTI, is often cited as one of the most effective treatments for chronic insomnia. It's more effective than sleep medication in the long term, with effects that persist way after treatment with medication would normally disappear. CBTI addresses the thinking patterns and behaviors that maintain insomnia, including the anxiety about sleep that becomes its own driver. and it uses a structured program that includes sleep restriction stimulus control, relaxation techniques, and cognitive restructuring of unhelpful beliefs about sleep. In the UK, Sleepio is a digital CBTI program developed by sleep researchers at Oxford University. It's available free on the NHS in some areas and by subscription otherwise. It's got a good solid evidence base and it's accessible without a referral. The NHS Every Mind Matters Sleep Hub also provides free introductory resources. For men who suspect sleep apnea, snoring, excessive daytime sleepiness, observed breathing pauses, or waking with headaches, a conversation with your doctor and a referral for a sleep study might be the appropriate first step. Beyond formal intervention, the behavioral components of good sleep hygiene are worth knowing because they work modestly and have got no side effects. So let's have a look at these in turn. The first is consistency. Going to bed and waking up at the same time, including weekends, tends to anchor the circadian rhythm and reduces the variability that undermines sleep quality. Temperature. The bedroom needs to be cool, around 17 to 19 degrees C. Core body temperature needs to drop for sleep to initiate and be maintained, and a warm bedroom fights the process. Light. Exposure to bright light in the morning anchors the circadian clock, so avoidance of bright and blue spectrum light in the hour before bed, such as you get from a mobile phone, reduces the suppression of melatonin that delays sleep onset. And that 3 a.m. problem, lying awake in the middle of the night, ruminating, well, that's best addressed by simply getting up, doing something calm in low light, perhaps having a warm drink, and returning to bed when sleepy. Lying in bed trying to force sleep while the mind races is simply counterproductive. It reinforces the association between bed and wakefulness, which is precisely the association you're trying to break. Most adults need somewhere between 7 to 9 hours of sleep. If you've been operating on the assumption that you're one of these people who need 4 or 5 hours, well, the research suggests you're wrong. Most men who make this kind of assumption are making it with a brain that's already been compromised by the very deprivation that they're underestimating. In other words, you cannot accurately assess how sleep deprived you are when you're actually sleep deprived. Poor sleep that's persisted for more than 3 months meets the clinical threshold for chronic insomnia. Starting with a visit to your doctor is appropriate, but rather than show up with a general complaint of not sleeping well, go with a clear description of the pattern, the onset, duration, the middle of the night waking, and early morning waking, and the daytime consequences. The more specific you can be, the more help this will be to your doctor. If sleep disruption is accompanied by persistent low mood, loss of interest, or significant anxiety, raise those issues simultaneously. The relationship between sleep and mental health is sufficiently close that treating one without addressing the other tends to produce incomplete results. Now, the earlier episodes you may or may not have heard on depression and loneliness are relevant here. Both conditions are closely connected to sleep disruption in ways that compound when they go unaddressed together. So now it's time to pull things together. Sleep, you'll have gathered, is not a luxury, neither is it a weakness. Unless there's a particularly strong reason for its disruption, it's not something you push through on the way to getting things done. It is, as I've described, the process by which the brain maintains itself, clearing the waste, processing emotions, consolidating memories, and restoring the regulation that the day depletes. The man who treats sleep as optional is not being productive. He's borrowing against a debt that the brain will eventually collect in mood, in cognition, and in physical health, and in the accumulated cost of nervous system that's been running without adequate maintenance for longer than it was ever designed to. Now, the investment required from you isn't dramatic. It consists of bedtimes, a cool, dark room, less alcohol or no alcohol in the evening, and, if the problem's persistent, a conversation with your doctor rather than another night of hoping it'll just resolve itself. It's not going to resolve itself, but it will respond to attention. Now, you'll find the full written article for this episode on drjerrykennard.com in the Mind and Body section.